Great.
Hello, folks. Good day. I am so happy to be able to share the next half an hour or so with my good friend Steve Gabriel, a person I've known as a designer and educator and farmer for probably getting close to 15 years now. Folks are probably familiar with Steve already, but in case an introduction is helpful, he's the author of this fantastic book here, and the co-author of the forest farming book. He and his wife and family are farming in the Finger Lakes region in New York State and doing some really innovative stuff. He's also been a longtime educator in the permaculture and agroforestry worlds, and then also has worked as an extension agent through Cornell. And so I really appreciate all of the insight you bring, both as an educator and practitioner and author. And I am just thrilled to kind of pick your brain a little bit and talk shop, because it's hard to make time to do these sorts of things. And there's only so many people that are doing things that are out of the ordinary that I'm connected to. And so I really appreciate all the experience you bring. So thanks for joining us, Steve.
Yeah.
If you have anything you want to
Absolutely.
say in rebuttal, but the theme here really today was I just wanted to take an opportunity to pick your brain a bit about just the use of tree leaves as feed for livestock, because I see a lot of interest in my work helping introduce people to coppicing. And I have some experience. We have a small flock of sheep on our property, and they get access to tree leaves here and there, but I know you've delved into this even more,
Mhm.
and so I guess I thought we could just start off with a little bit of like terminology, because fodder and browse and tree hay kind of get tossed around and intermingled. So maybe just how do you often frame this discussion when we talk about like what are we actually talking about when we think about tree leaves as feed for livestock?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the challenge is the terminology is sort of unconfirmed or sort of all over the place. So, we have forage, generally speaking, could be anything that an animal would eat. Browse also could be that. Fodder can also be that if you look at the definitions. It's challenging in that regard. Um, so I like to at least distinguish the different things. So when I think of forages, I'm generally thinking of things on the ground, grasses and legumes and forbs, which are just flowering green plants, but not woody in general.
Mhm.
So the stuff that we traditionally be building our pasture mixes out of,
Yeah.
and then again, fodder can mean anything technically that you feed to an animal, but tree fodder, I think, then distinguishes to say, yeah, we're looking at woody plants and we're mainly focused on the green leafy parts of those plants, although there's certainly some work folks are doing to play with the woody material itself, especially
Mhm.
with the sort of like pithier stuff or ramial newer growth on woodies, and then there's even ensiling and sort of storing and capturing and tree hay and drying and all these kind of different ways. But I think the starting point is the fresh leaves that are fed to the animals, as a direct food source. And I guess our excitement about it is, whether it's the wettest year on record or the driest year on record, which chances are this year will be one of those.
Mhm.
The leaves look great. They're available, they're sustainable, they're packed with nutrients. They offer a lot in that regard. And then I think beyond that, it's a whole world of primary and secondary compounds in this material that isn't readily available in abundance in the pasture forages that they can offer. So, and we've always like led by just seeing the animals. They like if they have access to it, they eat it, at
Mhm.
least to some degree.
Yep.
So there's something there that they want, and I think that's the important part.
Yep. Great. So you started to kind of wade into my next question, which maybe we will revisit from a slightly different angle. I'm a little bit plain ignorant here because I have my thoughts on why
Yeah.
people are interested in this.
Right.
But, you know, in this case, you're talking to someone who has no knowledge of, trees as a food source for livestock, but are already embroiled in, raising animals.
Mhm.
So you mentioned kind of redundancy and resilience, just based on the vagaries of unpredictable climatic patterns. You talked about a bit of diversity in forage, but maybe if there's anything you want to expand on that, especially for the skeptic, like not that you need to convince someone, but
Yeah.
you know, there's a lot of forage that's also grown, just herbaceous forage that's available. There's pretty efficient mechanisms for harvest. So
Mhm.
why do you see people finding value in this? And what are some of the other things that um, you know, tree fodder brings to livestock owners?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I came to that from sort of silvopasture. So there's a lot of reasons that trees are beneficial in grazing systems, right? And so often what's described as like trees for timber is like that's the reason you plant trees, which is a
Mm-hmm.
fine reason if that's what you want to do. But there's, as you know, so many other possible products, and
Yeah.
there's also so many sort of ecological roles trees play that can be beneficial. And I think for our experience, the reason we plant trees with our silvopastures is shade and shelter is like the main benefit. And we're focused more on fast growing, adaptable, easy trees, basically things that we don't have to tend incredibly, you know, to a lot in order to have them survive or thrive, and not necessarily things on a broad scale that we're going to also farm as tree crops, because that kind of adds like a double layer of management. So
Yeah.
um, and then things that we can propagate easily, all those kind of things is like been our focus. So shade and shelter to me is what comes back to for silvopasture, and what I hear a lot of practitioners actually interested in is the main motivation. So why not tack on fodder to that? Because depending on how we manage that, and there's a lot of questions there for sure, and there's definitely skepticism around the quantity, the timing of harvest, the capacity to match let's say if I plant a row of trees along a paddock fence, is that proportional to the number of animals that are coming up against that fence and could access that fodder? Is it one grazing event or two grazing events or three grazing events? What's the recovery rate after grazing tree fodder is a big question. Like we can calculate great, we can kind of estimate a recovery period for pasture, forages, but leaf material, there's big questions about it. Most of the fodder stuff that's really established is in the tropics, where everything just kind of like springs back overnight.
Explodes. Yeah.
That's certainly not the case here. So I think I think it has to be, I guess, all this to say there should be nested benefits, and I wouldn't plant trees just for fodder's sake. But if it also, holds the soil on a stream bank, or it also provides habitat for wildlife, or it also provides shade and shelter for grazing animals, then you start to have those multiple motivations for certain species and planting, and then the question is management. Are we managing them differently because we want to amplify the resprout and the leaf production, or make it easy for us to access it? Would be the only main difference. Like if I just want a tree for shade, it can grow tall and huge and the canopy can be 80 feet in the air. But if I want to
Mm-hmm.
harvest the fodder, then I got to think more about keeping it low, or having a mixed diversity in terms of structural planting.
Yeah. Awesome. I really appreciate the way you framed that, because I see things in a similar way. And but we've never really had this conversation, at least at this
Right.
point in our development. And so it's good to hear we're seeing things similarly, because what I've encountered a lot in several different phases of my experience as a young natural builder, moving into, agroforestry and keyline
Yeah.
and then the coppicing, is that a lot of times myself too, as a learner, I kind of latch on to these sort of more alternative systems or more innovative ways of thinking, often just almost from the outset presuming there's something superior by doing things differently than
Sure.
the status quo. And I feel like as I get older, I have more awareness around it as just being an alternative and another tool in the toolkit. But I find as I'm sharing some of these concepts with people, or even just like connecting with folks, um, fodder has become this thing that it feels like a lot of people latch on to almost
Yeah.
as just inherently superior to herbaceous forage. And I feel like the way you framed it as like, it's hard to argue with the benefit of shade and shelter in a pasture. Like everybody can see that.
Yeah.
And if, like you said, you're also getting this additional forage benefit with, secondary compounds that are valuable to livestock nutrition and performance, it's like all the better. And
Yeah.
obviously there's a
Yeah.
lot of other directions we can go with that to continue to improve the state of the art. But I feel like that's a very reasoned and sensible
Mm.
way of thinking about it without over promising anything to practitioners. And you, once again, I think it's hard to have these conversations without kind of delving into different areas. You have a little reflection on that?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's interesting how much people are really they do latch on and are interested in it, which indicates something about it. And I don't know what the something is necessarily, but it sparks people's curiosity, which I think is a really important entry
Yep.
into this. And I think that taking that and running with it's really important, and just treating this as we're in a phase of experimentation and seeing this as a tree fodder as a supplement to a good great
Yep.
system. Like it's not gonna just, it's sort of like the analogy of like, oh, is your strategy like feed the world? Like my goal isn't to feed the world, my goal is to sustain my family, my community. And in the same way, like the goal of tree fodder is not just to replace pasture. We still need pasture. There's a lot of good reasons for that.
Yeah.
It's more to diversify the diet and find ways to look, especially in a changing climate, of just a better adaptability, because we can't necessarily rely on grasses to regrow in the same way. If we had a dry hot summer last year, and
Sure.
our sheep spent most of that peak part of the summer in the woods eating tree fodder, just because that was what was available.
Yep.
And we're like, great, we're gonna be thinning more and doing that kind of thing. So just to kind of treat it as a piece of the puzzle, I think is really important. But definitely to recognize that spark and that potential to run with something that excites people is really important too.
Yep. Yep. Um, so off the top of your head, top 5 to 15 species. Don't think about it too much. Just make a
Uh,
list and we'll move on. But what are your
yeah.
favorites based on your
Well,
experience?
I mean, when I wrote the book, it started out with this huge pile of species, and then decided to actually go really small, because I think the overwhelm of possibility, especially at larger scales, like grazing scales, it could get really complex really fast. And I think
Mhm.
folks just need to build relationships with like tree planting and make it easy and just sort of start. So I felt like what are the top few to start with, right? And
Yep.
um that was pretty easy then, because there's actually research on several species that clearly have promise, have utility, are easy to work with. If you kill some, it's fine. It's not like these are going to be
Yeah.
high cost trees to establish. So I think the go-tos are willow and poplar, because you can probably find those in the landscape already and just propagate them from cuttings.
Yep.
And within those two broad categories, there's hundreds of variants. There's a lot of cross pollination. There's a lot of, especially the willow, you know, named cultivars of willow are sometimes dubious, because there's just so much hybridization out there.
Mm.
And so you find cool, healthy trees, and you're like, great, I could just cut a stick and start planting, start growing.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of clear, like they kind of, from a nutritional standpoint, are sort of analogous to like grasses. Like they have sort of a decent palatability, good digestibility, and like a good spectrum of nutrients. Willow in particular is like higher in zinc and magnesium, which is often deficient in pasture plants. And willow has the added benefit of condensed tannins, which have a lot of benefits, especially to ruminants, for reducing parasite load and reducing their methane output. There's been good research on that. So, and what's interesting about willow is you'll see the animals like limit their intake, because that tannin kind of
Mm.
stops them from eating too much.
Sure.
So I wish we planted a lot of dense willow. So some paddocks just have tons of it, and there's no way they're gonna like eat through it. And that's good in some ways, so they're not gonna like completely defoliate. But in other ways, I wish I had taken these dense plantings and kind of spread them out so that they had access to it on a more routine basis, which is something we're working on.
Yeah.
Probably another one, a mulberry would be the next one that has, in the global sense, like the most fodder documentation, just like common fodder plant, and so palatable that it's even been used for chicken and hog feed. They'll like pelletize it in China and use it as like a
Mm-hmm.
off the counter feed, and a lot of mulberry breeding is because of silkworms in the silk industry. So there's quite a bit of, production for high leaf volume. There's a lot of um, adaptability for different subspecies and different sites. I mean, it just kind of grows everywhere, and it grows like a weed in a sense. Once it's established, one of the challenges is propagation can be tricky, and sort of figuring out what you have is tricky. So there's red mulberry and white mulberry, but there's again a lot of hybridization, and so yeah, so there's if you want to know exactly what you have, then it can be a little bit more dicey, but that one seems to have a lot of promise, and it is a little harder to establish, but once it's there, it's pretty robust and easy to work with.
Yep.
Black locust, are the tree folks love or hate.
Mm-hmm.
Like the enemy, public enemy number one.
Yeah. Yeah.
But or some other legume tree, right? Something that's fixing nitrogen is going to have a high protein fodder. Black locust is essentially nutritionally equivalent to alfalfa, so really gives a boost in that regard. But we found in our farm research that like buckthorn, which is another invasive, but it's persistent and very much on a lot of our farm landscapes, is also really high in protein, and debatable about it. Actually, it's nitrogen fixation, but some kind of high protein tree I think is good to focus and kind of round things out. So you have your mulberries, your willows, your poplars, kind of this high palatability, lots of nutrient profile.
Mm-hmm.
Get some condensed tans with the willow. Black locust, you get a little bit of that high protein, or some other fodder that has like a high protein would be like rounding out the diet, And then I think beyond that, it's sort of back to what we talked about, which is like, what are your other goals? What trees excite you? What things do you want to explore? What's biolocally available? I'm really inspired by there's a book called Trees of Power by Akiva Silver. He's a nursery practitioner close to me. And what was most inspiring about what he wrote about and how his approach is, really he's just paying attention to his local landscape and seeing what characters are out there being overlooked that he could be propagating and expanding. And that's following that curiosity has led to a lot of things. So I think those are the ones that I found had a lot of good research, clear benefits, clear good niches and ecosystems. And then from there, you can really just, choose your own adventure based on what your interests are. I think. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. So kind of moving along here, getting into like systems and, timing and some of the stuff you already touched on a little bit. I find, and I haven't dug deep into a lot of the literature on this. I've delved a little bit into some of the, fodder bank, fodder block systems from the tropics. I know you've got that SARE grant that you were recently awarded, which I just was made aware of recently and was kind of perusing that. But I've been getting a bunch of questions from folks on like the timing, the strategy, recovery periods, and I basically have nothing for them in terms of information for the temperate world. And I don't know how many people out there really do. I feel like it's the kind of thing where you have to kind of push plants beyond the limit to find out what is tolerable. And that's, I think, why what you're talking about too is like just starting with robust species that you can establish for minimal cost. It's like, or that are already there already. It's like, well, what's the loss if you killed that patch of buckthorn along the field edge? But what any insights you can share, like when you start to think about some of these either hedgerows that have been planted as like a kind of direct browse sort of system, or I don't even know. I don't know if anyone besides you that are proposing like planting fodder blocks of woodies, but in your mind, like what are you kind of imagining? Do you think they could tolerate yearly, twice a year? Like, I mean, it also gets into like how long do you want that to remain productive too?
Right. Well, yeah. million questions there. I mean, I
I
do think
know.
kind of funny. I think the so-called invasives are just like the naturalized non-native species are really an interesting starting point because
Yep.
we're kind of using our animals then as they're managing vegetation, they're keeping potentially buckthorn or honeysuckle from like flowering, going to seed, that sort of thing. So maybe long term we're reducing that, spread, but and like autumn olive's another good one has great fodder. So they all have these like amazing fodder profiles, and they're already persistent in landscape, and our animals can help control their size and potentially propensity to spread. And what a great space to experiment, because worst case you kill it and you're like, oh, that's what people want us to do anyway. Which
Exactly.
I'm not
Yeah.
sure actually. I think that was my original, when Elizabeth and I looked at the site, we're like, we got to get rid of this stuff, or that's what NRCS tells us, we got to get rid of this stuff. But now I'm like, it's doing really well in the drought. I think I want to
Hmm.
keep it around because it's maintenance free essentially. So
Yeah.
fun pollarding and coppicing buckthorn, for instance, and just seeing how it responds. And some of that inspiration came because I knew folks at Cornell were trying to like kill it with herbicide even and couldn't get it to die. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, well, if this really wants to persist that hard, it's probably got good qualities for what I want.
Sure.
And so I think that's a good place for people to just experiment, make those funky cuts and try different heights and different times a year, and just kind of, I think the key is taking good notes, because we don't have a clear, everyone always
Mm.
wants to say, well, this is what you do here and there and there. And it's like, no, we don't know. Let's try 3 or 4 different treatments, but we got to keep track of what we learned
Yeah.
one way
Yeah.
or another. One of the things I got into recently is there's like an app called Gaia GPS, which is a nice mapping app. It's actually made for like hiking and recreation, but it'll help you geolocate a point in time. You can take a picture and then you can import those into Google Earth. So I'm able to kind of catalog, oh, I took a picture and a note of this thing on this day. And it's kind of easy for me then to put it back to our design, what we use for main like design and record keeping up for the farm, which is like just
Nice.
Google Earth,
Yep.
free. So there's simple ways to do it. It doesn't have to be a deep exploration into research, right? So I think that's one thing. I think, like I said, with willow in particular, it is going to be something that animals will browse and probably not completely defoliate, but our strategy has been to sort of browse multi-stemmed forms of willow when, at least a third to a half of the forage is out of reach. So if they're
Mm.
below, they're not able to defoliate the whole plant. And then the multi-stem is also nice because they're not tending to like work too hard to like get into the interior of the plant. So even if they strip bark, which they don't tend to do a ton with the willow, anyway, like they're not destroying the whole plant. So it's sort of like, and I think residency and timing is also key, right? Like if you leave an animal in with something for too long, it's gonna start to,
Yeah.
we lost a lot of black locusts because boredom led to bark stripping. It wasn't that
Sure.
they were like hungry. It was like, let me play with this. And it's almost like, it's funny because black locust is almost like string cheese. I don't know if you've had any animals strip it. It's like they start at the top and just like peel it all the way down. You're like,
Hmm.
bummer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but anyway, I think so we found with some of the willow, we can graze it 2 or 3 times a season because they're not completely defoliating it. Other things,
Mhm.
um, with our locust, we're mostly at this point still planting standards and then pruning them and giving our sheep the prunings. So
Sure.
they can eat all that and that's fine.
Hmm.
They can't reach the tops of the trees. And so that's
Yeah.
kind of a way to limit too. If you wanted to limit, and you can kind of then choose how much you give them, that's the advantage of like a pollard, right? So,
Yeah.
my sense is that maybe once or twice a season is a good bet from a single plant, but we just don't really fully know. And interestingly enough, too, the resprout, like if trees are able to leaf back out, those leaves are even more palatable, that young growth.
Mm.
And so it's probably a case where if you graze it once, come back around your second rotation, and like it is resprouting, well, the animals are going to be really attracted to it, but that means they might actually go harder on the plant.
Yeah.
So that can be good or bad, right? It depends. But yeah, it's really the big thing. I think that excluding plants and sort of regulating the feeding can be a really good strategy if you're concerned about something getting destroyed. And if you just want to play and observe, play with the plants that feel like they have, a lower risk factor is kind of how we're approaching it. And then in general, with any tree planting, like ideally we're planting really densely and thinning over time. That's how a forest plants. So I'm trying to always encourage people to stop thinking about like, what I do is plant these individuals like out in a pasture. It's like we need to plant communities. So we try to plant in rows or thickets or hedges. Yeah. We prep all that soil, we add organic material, we plant, multiple communities. And that could be one species, or it could be multiple subspecies, or it could be multiple different species in that plot. In a 50-foot row, you could have, just elderberry, you could have a willow, poplar, black locust hedge, but I think by planting densely too, you can also start to see then some of your activity is thinning and removing, and the animals can play a role in that. But spatial patterning is something that we all need to kind of play with some different configurations and think about that. And I think in sort of what I alluded to before, like in relationship to our rotation system, the best thing is if the animals are in the right place at the right time when you feed it. Not, I wish they could get willow, but it's actually on the other side of the farm, which is kind of some of what we've done, Yeah. So I think like a diversity of hedges that are alongside of a fence is kind of what we're often going for, because they're still getting established, and then we can kind of figure out how the animals can interact,
Yep. Excellent. So
long-winded and unsatisfying, because then everyone always wants that specificity, but
I know that
we're just
that's
not there
the
yet,
answer,
right?
though. Yeah, exactly. And even if you are, it's like it still depends. And so you can give a general idea, but yeah, how like you said, how long are the animals given access to the plant? How heavily are they going to browse it? So as these browse plants get more mature, you're going to tend to see less leaf, I'm assuming, lower down on the plant, probably, right? And so have you kind of, how has your kind of thinking evolved around that? Because I mean, obviously with coppicing, you could, rejuvenate it, especially with the shrubby species or with any of them. But is that kind of what you imagine? And then obviously there's probably needs to be a bit of a lag there in terms of just allowing the plant to kind of rebound before it gets hammered really hard again by livestock.
Yeah, and we've experienced that with some of the willow. We have let the animal, like, we'll coppice them and then we'll let the animals have access, and they just keep beating on them and they're just not recovering, right? So and then if you're coppicing, of course, there's also potential deer pressure for a lot of us too. So I think like the concept of like, how are we, it's just like fencing, when we're grazing, fencing is both to keep animals in a certain space, but also to exclude them from other spaces. I think that successful tree fodder, when I think of a fodder block, what I'm thinking of is a place where I'm going to exclude deer while it's getting established, and then either harvest and bring to animals or let the animals into it for a certain amount of time, but then exclude those grazing animals as well. And that I need to make sure there's sufficient rest and recovery, just like with good pasture management. And I don't know what that looks like yet. So again, good rules of thumb can be, well, I haven't grazed it so much that more than half the vegetation's gone. That would mean we're not like denuding its potential to keep photosynthesizing for the grazing season. And usually what we're talking about is the plant is being stripped versus it's not like it's being erased, right? So do we have to go in after that and prune things or cut things or I found a lot with the multi-stem willow, it wants to be hit a lot more in terms of being cut back to the base so that it gets regeneration. If you start to have these stressed out stems, they start to get real woody and sort of unproductive. Like our best willow fodder was the hedge we laid because it like rejuvenated the whole stand, and they are just like thriving now because of that intervention where we basically cut everything down to the ground, excluded the animals for a couple seasons, So that's what I recommend, is like plant your fodder plantings like along edges or areas where you can exclude, and then play with that introduction of animals, and or just harvest it and bring it to them. that can
Yeah.
also be really, I think, viable approach to being able to control that,
Awesome. I have so many more questions, but I'm going to try to direct us towards a convenient spot to close. Any people, farms that you would recommend folks check out who just want to see some other examples of folks doing this? Are there, either online resources or just like names of people or farms?
Yeah. I'm working on a project right now with some folks where we're doing a video series on Silvopasture in the
Great.
Northeast
Cool.
for the National Agroforestry Center. So that'll be coming out over the course of the summer, and there's several farms in there that are, it's a spectrum of like intentionality versus just like opportunistically working with tree, right?
Yep.
Of course, Shanna Hansen's farm up in Maine. I think she'll be in some of those videos. Three Streams, is it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. Even our website just has a lot of really good references and resources, and I mean, her approach is much higher up. She's doing a lot of tree climbing and sort of management on a different plane, right?
Yeah.
I like to stay with my feet on the ground personally, but I think the interest in the creativity there and a lot of her knowledge is really powerful, especially if you're like looking to understand fodder in relationship to like milk products, because that's a whole nother rabbit hole. Right? Like I'm just looking to make sure my animals sustain and gain weight, not necessarily and can feed their young. I'm not necessarily like also thinking about that nutritional aspect for milk, or even like a fleece or something like that can be really important. And yeah, and I think there's not like you said, there's not a ton of examples of people that are like explicitly out there saying I am a tree fodder farm, right? So
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's kind of what comes to mind right now is some next steps for folks. The Silvopasture book website has a tree fodder page. It has the write-up of the report we did, actually nutritional analysis on 6 species.
Awesome.
And people can read that, and there's some more links there to other databases and papers around nutrition. But yeah, that was a big gap, and I encourage folks. I know there's more people out there doing it, so if folks are playing again, I would just encourage like document what you're doing in a way that's easy for you, and then share that, because we all got to learn a lot more a lot quicker, so
I agree. Well, I just want to appreciate the fact that you're as candid as you are with just the lack of information that's out there. And I think actually it's really empowering to folks to realize that we are kind of co-creating this state of the art and just figuring it out. And we have these kind of guideposts along the way, but at the end of the day, we've got to learn by doing. And I think that's an exciting place to be. So I want to thank you so much for your time, Steve. If folks haven't checked out the Silvopasture book, it's fantastic. Definitely recommend it. Also, Wellspring Forest Farm in Mecklenburg, New York. Great growers and really innovative land managers, stewards. So thank you very much, Steve, and keep up the awesome work.
Thanks, Mark. Good to chat.
Absolutely.